The series of talks and interviews on the Palestinian topic bring up two main questions. The first is that despite the deep crisis that we find ourselves in, and it seems to be pushed into a corner, we cannot ignore it long term. And it is truly embedded in any true decision that Israel has to make. And the other conclusion that emanates from all that is that these dramatic changes have to be led in the amongst the Palestinians. Only then will we be able to promote evaluations and recommendations vis-à-vis the Palestinians and that context. So I think that after we've charted out the political, security, international issues connected to that theater, we're going to dive more deeply into other issues, mostly the economic issues. So we've had an interview with Professor Avi Ben-Bassat from the Professor Emeritus of Economics to see the connections between the two economies, the Palestinian theater and the Israeli ones, especially about the future and its derivative through the political process and in that context. Shalom, one and all. Only a few weeks have passed since the annexation crisis that really made the waters turbulent around us. And Israel, the question is whether it has been taken off the table altogether or not. But now there's still so many questions vis-à-vis the Israeli and Palestinian conflict still exist. And how can we reach some kind of scenario, hopefully, of what will happen in perhaps one state or not one state? So I think the economic factor and component, which really has tremendous impact on the future of our ties, especially if we're talking about one state solution, what will the economy look like and how will the various other issues impact the possible scenarios? So today we're having this discussion now with Professor Avi Ben-Bassat, who's the Director General of the Ministry of Finance and a Senior Director of the Research and Foreign Currency Departments, with very rich knowledge and background in the field of the negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel. And we would like to talk about this since the 90s, because he was very deeply immersed in it since the Oslo Accords as well. And so we would like to really deliberate it and see how these economic ties actually are now and what their future is. I'm going to start with an opening question which touches upon his personal background. And Professor Ben-Bassat, your personal background, and since it's 25 years since the Oslo Accords, how do you actually foresee these economic ties, and how can you qualify these two economies and the affinity between them? Both of these economies are very different. I mean, on every dimension, not only the size, the level of development, their standard of living. I'll just talk about the order of magnitude. The Israelis buy 3 times more than the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. If you talk about the GDP, ours is 8 times bigger than in Judea and Samaria. So we're talking about $40,000 per capita as opposed to $15,000 in Judea and Samaria. So if we look at the economy, that the unemployment there is very high. And I'm not only talking about now where it's high in Israel as well, but I'm talking about pre-corona days. We're talking about a very high percentage. It was only 4% in Israel as compared to theirs. So if we're talking about these gaps, and the standard of living dictates issues of the trade between them. Israel, for example, will import workforce and also various commodities, but our export to Judea and Samaria is much higher than their import from us. And so therefore you can see that $2.5 billion gap in their actually trade issues. So these are the very important data that have significant implications on the possibility, and if we are talking about the annexation and everything connected to that. So in fact, you're talking about two entities that are interwoven with each other and cannot really be disconnected. Yes, truly. Yes, we're talking about, yes, customs and trade and sort of tax, sort of total interweaving and connections. There's a free sort of flow of workers coming in. Sometimes there are closures because of security reasons, but mostly it's Palestinians who come in and work here in Israel, and they buy their commodities from us at a very higher level. So if we were to separate, so I think in the field of work, then we would have to bring in a very high percentage of foreign workers. If we take the picture from the past and the present situation, I think while talking about a scenario of annexation of the sea territories and perhaps take over the whole of the West Bank, whether in a direct manner or perhaps something that happened sort of unplanned and undirected. How can you see sort of what could possibly happen? Well, if we do annex the sea territories, there are about 300,000 Arabs who live there. And as I said, the standard of living there is much lower. So the moment we annex them, they will at least get the civil rights that exist in Israel. At least they'll have the services that we do provide, like national insurance, health, education, etc. But they will pay taxes according to what their income is. In other words, the expenditure in Israel will increase by 10 billion shekels a year. So I think that most of them, if you look at their income, won't actually be paying income tax. So therefore, I think every year the burden on Israel's economy will grow by at least 8.5 billion shekels a year, which of course will fall upon the rank and file in Israel, the man in the street. So beyond that, the actual annexation could create dynamics of, again, terror attacks, and the Palestinian Authority would probably collapse because they wouldn't be able to function in such circumstances. And then we'll find ourselves controlling the entire Judea and Samaria, and we'll have to actually provide civil rights to all of those inhabitants. And therefore, the economic burden on Israel will, of course, then really go overboard. So in that sort of case, the order of magnitude of our annual expenditure would be 67 million, and the income from that will only be 15. So therefore, again, if you compare this data, you'll find that it'll grow by about 52 billion per year. So really, if our annual budget is 400, so we're talking about a very high and significant percentage which will fall upon the Israelis, men in the street kind of shoulders. So if you look and compare to the European Union or the Qatar, and you think about what they're going to be able to do in aid, if they aren't going to continue with that aid, then really one has to think about all that. And it doesn't conclude with that. It's an enormous burden, and it's a problem per se. I think that based on our experience in Jerusalem, this burden has additional implications that are very far-fetched vis-a-vis demography in the area. The demographics will change. After all, when the burden expands, then people become embittered. Their motivation dwindles. If you take the history of Jerusalem from the beginning of the 90s, if you're talking about the demographics and this increase in the population, and the stronger population has felt that burden, so they've paid taxes, but they receive so many less services. And so this strong population from Jerusalem has found itself moving out. So those who've remained have, of course, their burden has increased in such a way that it is really damning to all of them. So you can see that the whole town situation is deteriorating. In the 90s, you can see how their rating has gone down from 6 to 3, and now we're talking about a social cluster, social economic cluster, really deteriorating. So I think this is what is happening. So if this burden on the actual Israeli population grows because of the actual annexation of Judea and Samaria, then again you'll see changes, you'll see migration, you'll see people leaving. People may even leave the state of Israel. Who can actually migrate? It's mostly the strong population, that strong population with the higher levels of education. Suddenly you're going to perhaps envision and witness a whole process that might be very detrimental to the state of Israel. I mean, you can testify to that if you look at what happened in Jerusalem and what happened to certain towns in the United States after the Second World War. So here, I mean, you're talking about real social changes that are very far-fetched. Post-Second World War, the stronger population moved out to the suburbs, and then the center of towns, for example, like in Philadelphia, remained impoverished more. Yes, they were still strong, but when they saw that their burden was so much greater on their shoulders, you saw this process that deteriorated, and Philadelphia did so until they actually did create some kind of rescue program. Now, if we're trying to analyze the economic and demographic dimensions and the impact of the merging of economies and how it impacts both of these populations, and you spoke about migration, could there be additional social implications, for example, the cultural implications? Yes, I think that people will be impacted not only by the economic dimension. After all, we're talking about if this becomes a one-state solution, then the whole character, the various characteristic traits will change. You'll look, for example, how the whole equilibrium changes, and there'll be tremendous pressure, and the Arab side and their weight will be much greater, and perhaps there will be more involvement in the life of the state, and perhaps, but will they join the military or various other things. I think that the whole character will change. It's the same if we carry out that annexation in Judea and Samaria. Of course, things will change. Yes, the culture will be much more merged. So with that kind of reality, do you believe that this could really last long term? Well, I'm sure there'll be tremendous tensions. It's hard to say how far downhill this could actually go and what slippery slope will be created. But I mean, you can see how there are separations of various population groups in other countries, but it does happen. I would like to thank you, Professor Ben-Bassat, for a fascinating talk, and I sincerely hope that we arouse this discourse, which is so essential and vital to what is perhaps on the horizon. And I'm sure that it was less turbulent than what is expected. And thank you for actually truly showing us and presenting that economic angle to it all. And I sincerely hope that we did arouse the complexity of this problem to the Israelis, which is perhaps even existential for all of us. Well, thank you very much to you too.